From the New York Times Learning Network, I'm Ross Flatt. We want to welcome you to today's webinar, Teaching with Graphs from the New York Times. In our mission to seek the truth and help people understand the world, the Times uses a wealth of multimedia tools, both in print and online. So whether you're interested in viewing a state-by-state breakdown of a presidential election, or maybe you want to track the ups and downs of our nation's economy, or maybe you're consuming the statistics of your favorite sport, our graphs will help you do just that. So the Times publishes so many incredible graphs that in 2017, the Learning Network, in collaboration with the American Statistical Association, created What's Going On in This Graph. It's a weekly feature that helps you and your students question, analyze, and discuss graphs and the data they reveal. So in today's webinar, we'll introduce you to this feature, What's Going On in This Graph. You'll learn how you can select graphs that connect to your curriculum. We'll hear from current educators about how this feature can engage students. And finally, we'll show you practical ways that you can use what's going on in this graph with your students, both in person and remotely. So today, I'll be joined by Sharon Hesney. Sharon is a teacher in Boston who works with both the American Statistical Association and the Learning Network each week to curate, write, and moderate what's going on in this graph. We're excited to be joined by her today, and we'll meet her in just a few minutes. So first, I'd like to get us familiar with the basics of what's going on in this graph. So the most important thing, if you want to use it, is to figure out how to access it. So to access what's going on in this graph, you would start by going to the Learning Network homepage, nytimes.com/section/learning. And you would scroll down, and you would find the multimedia icon, the yellow square with the camera in it. You click on that, and it takes you to our multimedia features, such as what's going on in this picture, and Film Club, and of course, what's going on in this graph. So you can click that, and that will take you to our What's Going On in This Graph main page. Now you'll see the latest features that we put on the site are right at the top, and as you scroll down, you'll see that we have our older What's Going On in This Graph features posted below. So if you're looking for something that maybe isn't featured in the most recent one, you should be able to find it. So for example, if you want to select one, you can click on What's Going On in This Graph, Internet Privacy Policies. We'll open that one up, and as you can see, that's what one of the features would look like. And that's going to bring us to our first interactive. So here's what we'd like you to do. We want you to look at this graph and respond. What do you notice, and what do you wonder? That's it. So again, take a look at this graph. What do you notice? What do you wonder? And we'll check in about 30 seconds to 1 minute. I'm going to make this graph just a little bit bigger for you to see it more clearly. Okay, and I'm noticing a lot of noticing and wonderings coming in the group chat. And before I call a few of these out and share some of these with everybody, I'm actually going to invite Sharon Hesney, a teacher from Boston and a representative of the American Statistical Association, who's been working with the Learning Network on what's going on in this graph since its inception. So welcome, Sharon.
Hi, Ross.
How are you?
Good.
All right, so thanks for joining us. Sharon, I don't know if you can see the group chat. I'm taking a look at it right now, and people are sharing a lot of different things. Somebody noticed that somebody mentioned that the New York Times isn't on this graph, which is interesting. Somebody's noticing companies, social media, books are not high in readability. So somebody is wondering what is in the x-axis. So lots of different wonderings that we might have here. So we're going to come back to this in a minute, Sharon. We're going to kind of talk about why we open this What's Going On in This Graph feature with these two questions. But would you be able to tell us a little bit about what's going on in this graph So how did it start, and what do we need to know?
Yeah, so how it started was maybe about 20 years ago in my own classroom. I'd read the newspaper with my coffee every morning, and I'd rip out a graph and I'd throw it under the overhead in the days of overheads and say, look what's going on in this. And we just talk about what's the world that the students lived in. And, I always would bring things that would be of interest to them. So about 3 years ago, the American Statistical Association, a professional organization of statisticians that I belong to, said, we really want to increase the public's exposure to understanding statistics. Anyone got any ideas? And I said, oh my goodness, the New York Times has the most incredible graphs. Why don't we do something with the graphs? So we approached the Learning Network, and they've been around for 20 years. They already had a feature called What's Going On with This Picture that was very popular. And oh my goodness, it's obvious from there. We should say what's going on with this graph. And so we started with that. We combined the graphs with Annie Fetter's What Do You Notice, What Do You Wonder? And 27,000 responses later online, 73 graphs. We have been going forward on increasing students' understanding on graphs.
Okay, so this has been one of our most popular features. So if we were just to kind of share the very basics of what's going on in this graph, if you're a teacher who's never heard of this before, that 15% we have in this webinar, what's the minimum they need to know about it?
Well, of course it's terrific, but the most important thing you need to know is it's free. Okay, and as a teacher, it is totally online. So with your students, whether they're in class or they're remote, access is complete. It's weekly. It's consistent. We do the same thing every week. And then we live moderate weekly, where students can have teacher moderators and students from around the world reply to what they notice and what they wonder. It's 100% accessible for any ability levels, middle school through college. We have a lot of college people, but we have a lot of middle school people as well. Of course, it's for the math and statistics class, but because the content varies so much from graph to graph, we have plenty of science classes, history classes, language art classes that participate. We would like to think there's zero prep time on your part. Because it's consistent, you get the same product every week.
Okay. So this is really cool. And what I really like about this feature is, you don't necessarily have to be a student in statistics, AP, or a 12th grade calc student. You can be a middle school student. You can know nothing really about, X and Y access, but you can learn about that from using this feature.
And as a teacher, you don't have to know either, because as we'll see later in the resources, we provide those for teachers.
Oh, that's cool. Okay, so why don't we do this? Why don't we take a look at one of the features by going into, we're going to go back to the Learning Network page. We're going to take a look at this, what's going on in this graph feature, Internet Privacy Policies, that we saw. So I'd like to walk through the feature. So can you talk us through what are the nuts and bolts? What are we seeing here?
Okay, so every week we're going to give you a graph. And in the graph, we're going to ask you the 4 questions. What do you notice? Every student can notice something, okay? What do you wonder? That's the questions, the unanswered. And we expect that students yes, they can write it themselves, and yes, they can input it, but it's really important that students talk to each other, because it's only by building on their understandings of what they notice and what they wonder that students will really be able to tease out the story in the graph. Third question is, what impact does this have on you and your community? And since we always pick graphs that the students can relate to, there's usually an answer to that. And then finally, this is a newspaper. Give us a catchy headline. And every week we shout out to a couple really good catchy headlines.
That's cool. And we're going to see a few of them from this example later. Okay. So you mentioned there, so there's these questions, and really it sounds like part of what's going on in this graph is this conversation between students. So can students post answers to these questions online?
Yeah. So you'll get the full schedule later, but we release it on Friday. And from that point on, students can respond. And it's very easy for them to register and do that. But on Wednesday, we reply to them. And what's really cool is other students reply to them. The old story of, it's not your zip code that determines who you learn with. Okay, so here you can see a bunch of responses and that students gave, and there I am, and I replied to a student, and then someone replied to me.
Okay, so it's this really neat kind of back and forth, and I can say, as somebody who helps moderate the message boards on the New York Times Learning Network, it's very, very popular when you're doing the live moderation. So it's one of the coolest things about this feature, I think. All right, so they've answered the questions either online or maybe in their classroom. They've posted them. Maybe they even talked to you a bit when you were moderating. So do they ever get to find out where the graph came from and what it's really all about?
Yeah, so the day after we moderate, we post the reveal. And the reveal can be read by students, it can be read by teachers. The expectation is it's not necessarily a math teacher, because it could be a student or an English teacher or history teacher, okay? We give you the free link to the article that included the graph and an explanation of what kind of was going on in the graph. Then you can see below that, we give you some additional questions that you can ask your students. Some of the questions get into more depth about the statistics of the graph, and some are really just questions that go beyond. For example, on this one, on the internet privacy, we say, here's the New York Times privacy policy. What do you think of it? Okay, and then there's also an explanation from the Times of why they have that particular policy. So we give you that as well. The stat nuggets are statistical and mathematical terms that you're going to see in the graph. We give a layman's definition, not a statistical definition, for each of these. And then we specifically tell you where you're going to see it in the graph. And this is really helpful to teachers that want to go a little bit more in depth about what's going on in the graph.
Yeah. All right, so let's get to the next, I guess, more important part is, when does this happen? What you were mentioning, Wednesdays, Fridays. What's the schedule for this?
It's continual. Okay, so here goes. On Fridays, we post what we call the release. It's the graph and the 4 questions. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Then you're invited to wonder and notice anytime you want. Okay. But on Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time to 2 p.m. Eastern Time, teachers moderate, okay? And we will moderate anything that appeared before Wednesday, and we actually moderate ones that appear after Wednesday. And then the following day, on Thursday, end of day, we have what's called the reveal, and that's the stat nuggets, the additional questions, the link to the graph. We'll often tell students in the moderation, please come back tomorrow when you'll get the link that answers your wondering.
So let's talk a little bit more about graph selection. So you're the curator of what's going on in this graph. So I would love to talk just a little bit about how teachers can select the right graph for their classroom, and how you select graphs for what's going on in this graph. One way for teachers to get started with this feature is to use the weekly published graph and participate in the live discussion, like you said. But what if somebody wants to use a graph with a particular topic or a math concept? Is it possible to do this?
Yes. Regarding the selecting of the graphs, it's really important that students can see themselves in the graph. If they're not interested, if they don't see themselves, we're not going to get anywhere. I always like to pick graphs that have surprises. Okay. And that's really something, I never knew that before. My objective is when they walk out of the room, either consciously or subconsciously, they're still thinking about the graph. I want them to learn about the world around them, and the graphs are always timeless. Let's say you don't like the graph that we're using for whatever reason. First thing I will tell you, if you don't like it, I can guarantee the next week it is going to be completely different. Because I from week to week, the difficulty changes, The type of graph changes and the content changes. We never repeat them. But let's say on this particular week you don't like it. We have 3 indices. One index is by content. Okay. Second index is by type of graph, usually for math teachers, they want certain kinds of graphs. And the third one is by stat nugget. So if you're teaching a particular concept, and when I talk about concepts, I'm not only talking about, let's say, variability and association and line of best fit, which would be statistical concepts, but I'm talking about things like percentiles, percentage change, okay, absolute value. All of these concepts are listed, and you can go directly to the graph that has that.
Why don't we dive into this a little bit more? So you mentioned we had like 60 graphs, and now it's something
73
okay.
as of yesterday.
As of yesterday. All right. So let's take a look at how just a small handful of these graphs can be used in a variety of ways by teachers. So we're going to take a look at small little thumbnails of some of our graphs, and we're going to show the variety here. So why don't we start with different types of graphs? So what types of graphs might be featured?
Okay. I mean, on the first row, the third one over, that's a bar graph. That's pretty common. Okay. I'm showing you 2 different kinds of bubble graphs. The last one on the top row, that's a bubble chart. It's on a map. Okay. Which is really very interesting. On the bottom row, the second one, that's a scatter plot. Okay. For bubbles. Okay. We have some pretty unusual ones. So the first one, the radar graph, otherwise known as a fingerprint graph, my guess is you probably haven't seen one. Maybe sometime they're done for emotional intelligence, but your students haven't. But I guarantee this is on pop music, summer pop tunes. Okay. By the time they notice and wonder, they'll know what a radar graph is and how to read one. Below it is an infographic. All the way on the right, on the bottom row, is an area graph. Kind of a nice one for geometry.
Yeah. All right. So wide variety, and you said that you try not to use the same type of graph. So we won't see, 4 bar graphs or 4 bubble type graphs in November, for example.
You won't see 2 together that are the same.
Gotcha.
So you'll always vary.
All right. So let's take a look at the same graphs, but I want to see how we can look at them as topics to explore. Here they are. So same graphs, the radar, the bubble map graph. What are we seeing here?
Okay, the balances of summer pop tunes over the years. That means the characteristics. That's another word for characteristics. Second one, how nutritionists and the public vary on how nutritious they think certain foods are. Okay. The one after that is the cost of natural disasters over the years. The final one on that row is one we thought was going to be an absolute bomb, but I love the graph, so I had to put it in, which was international military budgets by country. It turned out to be one of the most popular graphs we've ever done. Okay. Bottom row is injuries by high school boys, by sport, by part of body. Okay. This is an interesting one because they're all absolute numbers, but what you really needed to do was talk about percentage differences. The next one is on retail sales, changes in retail sales in the pandemic. The one next to that is where have the 3 billion vanishing birds gone? And the last one is, what does $1 trillion look like? That was the market value of Apple and Amazon. And we showed it by these squares that added up to $1 trillion. The students were fascinated at looking at companies that they knew something about.
Yeah, that one was pretty crazy. I remember trying to get a larger version of that graph for a slide deck, and it was just so long because of the how large the $1 trillion got. So all of these really interesting topics, and again, thinking about it from different types of teachers, not just math teachers or science teachers, but there's a ton of different topics that you can bring in here. So why don't we take one final quick look at stat nuggets? The
stat nuggets, it has the words, the stat nuggets that we use for each. The for the pop tunes, we talked about what is an algorithm. It's a scatter plot. You're going to talk about association. On the bubble charts, you were always, and the one below it, we're always talking about the difference between the dimensions and the area.
Mm-hmm.
But the first two on the bottom row were the most interesting. I think when I'm reading students' responses and replying to them, confusion between actual numbers and percentages. Okay, so a graph will be in percentages, and one percentage will be greater than the other, and the students will say, "Well, that one is bigger," not knowing what the base is for either of them. So the one on high school boys' injuries, the stat nuggets we were talking about was percentage point difference and percentage difference, and how they're different and how you use them and when you use each. These seem like very basic concepts for high school, but boy, there's a lot of confusion here.
All right, so we can clearly see that these graphs have been very carefully curated, and the thought that's sort of put into not only selecting them, but what type of graph to use and what they can teach students. I would just love, you talked a little bit about about your strategy. Is there anything else that you're looking for in these graphs?
The graph has to have a meaningful comparison. An individual number is kind of interesting, but comparing to, just think of the military budget one really brought that out. When you saw the size of the bubble for the United States, okay, and you saw the size of the bubble for Saudi Arabia, that was pretty shocking, okay? Mm-hmm. And always coming back to a comparison, even think about things like the high school boys' injuries. Oh my goodness, is soccer really that much more dangerous than all those other sports? Well, by how much more dangerous is it? If there's not something to compare, it's really substantial, it's probably not going to be used.
So you mentioned connecting it to students' communities, and what we're going to do is we're going to take another look at that graph, the internet privacy policies that we looked at through another interactive. So everybody take a look at this graph again, and we'd like you to answer this question. What impact does this have on you and your community? I'm going to expand this graph a bit and give you about a minute to respond. Okay, so we have a lot of responses coming in here. Let's see what some folks are saying. All right, so one person said, we really don't understand what we are signing up for in the terms and agreements part. Another person mentioned that people are probably not likely to read much of these. Other people are saying, it could help me decide what sources to use for my students based on level of difficulty. That's really interesting. And another person pointed out that BBC has a low reading level for people of all language levels. Again, really, really interesting.
So that may be, I wonder why the BBC is so low. So this is one we'll say, come back tomorrow and read the article, but it's because they're part of the EU and its laws about keeping it that low. Okay.
I see.
I think the impact here is, what are privacy policies for? They're supposed to protect us. If we don't even know what they are they really protecting us? And of course, that's why the EU has a simpler one.
Okay. All right. And I love the addition of this question. This is a newer question. This is a new question for the 2020-21 school year. And it seems like it's been having a good impact in the responses that we've been getting from students. All right, so why don't we move on to student engagement? So let's think about the ways that what's going on in this graph can engage our students. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hear from Eric Alata. He's a computer science teacher at the Academy for Software Engineering in New York City. So he's been using what's going on in this graph for some time in his classroom, and we spoke to Eric last year. So why don't we take a look, and Eric's going to talk to us about making cross-curricular connections as he engages his students through this feature. So let's take a look and a listen.
My name is Eric Alata. I teach the Introduction to Computer Science course at a New York City public school called the Academy for Software Engineering. So this year I was finally able to use the What's Going On in this Graph activity to connect the computer programming work to the results of the computer programs, and also deeply connect the course into what students are doing in their living environment science class, and in their earth science class, and in their algebra class, where statistics and analyzing and interpreting data are important standards in those classes as well. The two main skills that I want to convey in Introduction to Computer Science are being able to apply computing tools to create something. So you could use a program to create an animation or an app or a website. I also want students to be able to interpret the results of the programs. So I want to support them using claim, evidence, and reasoning the same way they would in ELA or in science class. And I want them to do that, but with the results of computer programs. What's going on in this graph has changed a lot about my teaching by realizing how important it is to connect to ELA specifically, to connect to English, literature, and history classes. So what I mean is that those classes are developing routines and protocols for students to engage in discussion and use each other as resources, and to use discussion and writing to generate new ideas. The reason why that's important is that we can't rely on just like kind of self-guided learning to just come out of learning how to write a line of computer programming. The things that the English teachers are doing to help students unpack a difficult text, like our 9th grade teacher might be reading The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison or Frankenstein. I mean, these are incredibly difficult texts, but they have protocols that allow the entire classroom to engage. So I think being able to bring in those, so I've been able to bring in those tools that the other classrooms are developing. And because if I do it well, and this not always happens, but sometimes it does happen, where we're able to leverage something that's happening in another classroom, and then it clicks for students, like, oh, you mean you want us to do the same thing? And yes, I say yes, it's exactly the same. That is the same kind of building up of ideas, the same way that I need to be able to look at a complex problem and be able to solve it with different functions. It's the same way that I would look at a complex story and narrative and look at different themes and how the different characters interact. So I think we have a lot to do to leverage what's already happening, what students already bring to the table. And then that can really help us to not have to reteach those skills and routines, but also help the students feel more connected. And for me, it just has really changed how I think about computer programming, because there's so many more ways for students to get engaged. And then later on, I can teach them things that are maybe more technical or more complicated. But if I've gotten the engagement and with the discussion and the participation, then I've already gotten most of the way there.
Okay, so we just heard from Eric, who is a computer science teacher, and he talks about how he unpacks a graph with ELA skills. So what do students learn from engaging in what's going on in this graph, maybe apart from things like, the stat nuggets and, what a graph is and some of the data that they look at there?
The number one objective is that they learn how to tease out the story that's in a graph. Every student can notice something. I notice points. I notice they're going up, they're going down, whatever. They can notice things and they can wonder things. And working together, like Eric said, they can tease out the story. They learn how to use this strategy of noticing and wondering. And we have heard in school after school that noticing and wondering has migrated into other classes. They learn about the world that they're in. And I think the American Statistical Association has another really important objective. On one side, people believe that anything that's in a graph that they see in the newspaper is correct. Well, that's not true. We know that. Okay. But on the other hand, you shouldn't be cynical and say anything that's in a graph is not correct. okay, is lying. Okay, you need to be skeptical. And so as you start looking in the graph and say, I noticed this, I wonder, you keep going, you start getting an understanding of what's going on in the graph and what whether you should be how skeptical you should really be about it. And added together, that makes you a good citizen. And that's what we're really going for.
Okay. And you also, I think I heard you mention at some point that graphs tell these stories. And I think that's a really interesting connection to English language arts. So how do we have students tell these stories through graphs?
Well, by explaining what they notice and wonder, like, for example, in poetry, I mean, there's not one way to approach things. Every poem is, I can't give you rules on how to evaluate a poem. I can't give you rules about graph either. But with practice, we get better and better at it. And we've had classes, including Eric's, that's how we met him, that just come back week after week after week. And if you look at how the students respond, you know that they're getting better and better at it. I mean, my favorite story is the end of last year. We had one on it was scatterplot on baseball players' contract salaries and this statistic called WAR. WAR stands for wins above replacement, which means like how good you are, basically. And the student starts off by saying, and we've been watching the student all year, kind of, out of the corner of our eye. She says, I hate baseball. I don't know anything about baseball. But let me tell you what's going on in this graph. And she did. Okay? That is what we're going for.
All right. That's really interesting. And I like how it kind of can go both ways. Maybe you know a lot about the topic that you're looking at, but you don't really know much about interpreting graphs or interpreting data, or it can completely go the opposite way. And I love how this feature has these skills that help scaffold that, and teachers can do additional things to help scaffold this feature for their students. So speaking of sort of telling stories, I really love how what's going on in this graph has this sort of final question at the end, or this final challenge for students to write a catchy headline that captures the graph's main idea. So we're going to ask everybody to do one more interactive. We'd like you to write a catchy headline that captures the graph's main idea in this internet privacy policy graph. So again, write a catchy headline that captures the main idea. You can write that in the group chat, and we'll come back in about 30 seconds to 1 minute. Go ahead. Okay, so I'm seeing a few coming in right now. Suzanne said, are you reading the fine print? Leanne said, would you read this? Bernice said, are you really, really sure? Kona said, it's in the details. Somebody said, call your lawyer before you agree to privacy policies. Hillary mentioned, do these companies serve you or themselves? So lots of really interesting headlines that we have here. So this is a really interesting question. It's fun, but what else is so important about this question? How does this type of question further student understanding, Sharon?
A good catchy headline shows if the student really understands the graph. I mean, someone gave in another group said something like, do you need a PhD to go to Disneyland? Okay. Which captures a whole lot of what's going on in this graph. But it comes back to reality. Okay. We don't want a 5-paragraph essay. Can you put in a few words what's happening here?
Yeah, I like that. It really sort of distills it down and allows students to both sort of be creative if they want, and also really kind of show that they know what the graph is truly telling us. So I want to take a look at some of you mentioned that students who create really interesting headlines get shout outs. So
Yep.
I'm going to reveal some of these. So this was the original article. We read 150 privacy policies. They were an incomprehensible disaster. It's a really neat article.
I think it's
But
a
let's
great,
take a quick
it's not catchy.
look. So let's take a look at these ones. Any of them stick out to you?
Well, reasons why we always skip the terms of service, okay, coming from Ithaca. Okay. How about this for catchiness? Can't you understand privacy rules? Okay. You can see how students sign in any way they want, and that's how they signed in. And privacy policy, who reads them anyway? Now, that's interesting. I come from a school where those students are on every single week, and it's their history teacher that does it with them. And he requires that they do all 4 questions, and they're on every week. And but it's not a math class, and it's fascinating how much of the statistics they picked up during the year.
Now let's take a final look at the ways that teachers can use what's going on in this graph in the classroom successfully. So Sharon, in a minute or so, I'm going to ask you for some best practices. But what we'd like to do is, once again, show you some of the teachers that we spoke to about what's going on in this graph. So we are going to once again hear from Erica Latta from the Academy for Software Engineering in New York. And we're also going to hear from Lindsay Kotz. Lindsay is a math teacher at the Mansfield Magnet Middle School in Tucson, Arizona. That school is part of the Verizon Innovative Learning Network group of schools. So let's hear what Lindsay and Eric sort of have to say about really effective ways to use what's going on in this graph in their classroom. So let's take another look and a listen.
My name's Lindsay Kotz. I teach 8th grade math and Algebra 1 at Mansfield Magnet Middle School in Tucson, Arizona.
My name's Erica Latta. I teach at a New York City public school called the Academy for Software Engineering.
I started using what's going on in the graph towards the beginning of the year. So what I did is I took it and I used it as kind of a warm-up or informal learning routine. So I posted the graph to the kids and posed the question, what do you notice? What do you wonder? And so I had the students sit for a minute and just kind of think about it. And as they came up with answers, they would hold one finger up at a time, showing me how many answers they'd come up with. And then I would ask them to share with the class what they were thinking. And I would kind of pose the question of what's the graph really talking about and have them go further into analyzing it as a class.
So we do analysis that comes directly from the what's going on in this graph activity. So one of the things that we do is we'll take a chart that was produced by the New York Times data team in some place in the New York Times, and we'll put that up on the board. We'll come together as a whole class, and we'll go around the room making concrete observations about that graph. Now I've gotten some good tips and have improved this year at how to do that. So like some concrete steps would be to look at a graph as a class and focus the class's attention on the axes of the graph, the x-axis and the y-axis, and have them start making concrete observations. Sometimes a graph uses a linear scale, but sometimes the graph uses a logarithmic scale where the numbers aren't all the same distance away. So we need to unpack that and have students make concrete observations. And that's really the beauty of noticing and wondering strategies. They allow students to get started by making observations that are simple. And the more simple observations often lead to the more profound insights later on.
Teaching middle school, kids love to talk. They love to hear themselves talk. And that's how they learn, is by explaining things to others. So this really, I think, helped my students to understand things in a better way and give them another outlet to express themselves. And I think it just made them understand things better. Less is more.
I would add on to that too. You can go really deep with one graph. And at the beginning, I thought I had to use a lot of different ones and many different ones. I think choosing data and giving students time to really go through it is extremely helpful.
When we first went into the online learning and you guys posted graphs about COVID-19, I used those because that's what the students wanted to talk about. And I still wanted them to talk about math, but this allowed them to do both in a controlled setting and really get them to critically think about math and about what's happening at the same time. Sometimes I also go in and look to see if there's a graph that'll relate to the topic I'm teaching at the time. So for example, if we're looking at statistics, or if we're looking at linear graphs, in algebra, if we're looking at quadratic or exponential, there's always graphs that match those topics, and it allows the students to see real world examples of the topics we're learning as well. So what I started to do on Zoom was I would share my screen, which would have the graph on it, and then do the same thing. What do you notice? What do you wonder? And have them do the fingers, and then we'd share. I'd also start doing the breakout rooms with them because they could talk in smaller groups and really get into the depth of the conversation and write headlines together as a group, and share their answers that way, which I think works great and really gets them involved, and they love it.
Okay. So maybe before we add any strategies, Sharon, anything that they mentioned, that Lindsay or Eric mentioned, that really stuck out to you?
Well, the first one was Eric mentioned the logarithmic scale, and then which you is the more sophisticated. We've only done it once. And then Lindsay, the middle school teacher, showed that she used the graph with the logarithmic scale. So it was the first COVID graph on how infectious it was and how deadly it was, and that had to be logarithmic. Anyway, we get a lot out of the graph with not understanding logs, but then in the stat nuggets, we do explain it, okay? So, I think the most important thing is students really have to hear each other and build on each other's understanding, and that they need to focus on making comparisons and not just statements. These are really the best practices. And then after they've done it, give them a pause and say something like, okay, for homework, I want you to respond online, so that they can think through the process a little and get a whole lot more out of it.
For those of you who are on live right now, or maybe watching this later, we're including the best practices that Eric and Lindsay mentioned right here on the screen. But I'm curious, Sharon, is there anything that you've noticed people do that maybe, and any sort of like mistakes that people tend to make when they're using the what's going on in this graph feature that maybe they should think about avoiding or changing?
I can tell when there hasn't been a class discussion, okay? Because what the students say, whatever the grade level, is extremely superficial, and you know that there hasn't been any input. And so we'll often say in the moderation, you wondered this is a way to discuss it. Why don't you ask your classmates or ask people in your household? Realizing that a lot of kids are not, in a class right now. Right. It's
sort of like the discussion version of showing your work, and not just sort of saying, this is exactly what I see right here. There has to be a little bit more than that, and I think that's really important.
Think about the injury one. I guarantee that athletes went home and thought about that.
Yeah.
And it would be very cool if they kind of had a discussion with their friends, or they had it at the dinner table, and possibly even pulled out the graph to examine it a whole lot more. They'd be getting a lot more out of it.
Yeah, what I love about that graph is, first of all, I was a high school wrestler, so I looked at that from that lens, and it was interesting for me to kind of see, what was more dangerous, what was less dangerous, what I maybe thought would have been dangerous or a common injury, and it wasn't. And I could find that being, a really interesting discussion that students would be having, both with their parents, with their coaches, with their teachers, with their classmates. And I really love that that's built in to this feature, and something that teachers really should be thinking about as they're rolling this out in their classroom.
And we don't suppose that we actually know what you're going to be the ones that people are going to start talking about. I went to one class and I said, what's the graph that you've done? Oh, the cost of engagement rings. Okay, these were 14 and 15-year-olds. I have no idea why, but that was the graph they liked.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay, well, Sharon, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. I really hope we have a lot more participants in what's going on in this graph after today's webinar. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And I hope to see some people in a week and a half on a Thanksgiving graph.
All right. And today's webinar was produced by Callie Holterman and Rachel Manley. And on behalf of the New York Times Learning Network, I'm Russ Flatt. Thank you for coming, and we hope to see you again soon. Take care.